Just the sight of Grandma herself silenced the crowds. By the time we were trundling past the Coffee Pot Cafe and Uncle Grady was brandishing his sword, the applause began. Into Mary Alice's ear I muttered, "But why Ray Veach?" "I saw possibilities in him," she said coolly, showing off her loving cup to the crowds. "I didn't know he could dance." "Dance," Mary Alice sniffed. "He can barely walk. What do you think I've been doing all week? I've been giving him ballroom dancing lessons, and the big clodhopper tramped all over my feet. I'm crippled for life." The route of the parade crossed the Wabash tracks at the depot to give the other side of town a look, but the Bluebird train pulled in from Chicago right on schedule. It blocked the way and separated the parade just ahead of the Wiedenbach float, which drew up short. The cowgill's overworked old horse dragging our hay frame didn't notice. It clopped on and ran into Mrs. Wiedenbach's float. We bumped. I reached for Mary Alice to keep her from tangling in her skirts and pitching off the float. Mrs. Wilcox teetered on her stool. Of course, Mrs. Wiedenbach knew we were right behind her, crabbing her act with an old settler than her daddy. And her reciting nephew had finished out of the money at the talent show, so she was already upsetting off her feed with us. But now her old daddy turned around and looked back. He may not have known where he was, but there was nothing wrong with his eyesight. He read our sign over Uncle Grady, and his old pink eyes narrowed. He spoke sharply to his daughter, who laid a restraining hand on him. Then it all happened quick. Mrs. Wiedenbach's daddy slipped free of her, leaped out of his kitchen chair, and jumped off their float. He cocked his forage hat at a dangerous angle and stalked back to our hay frame. Glaring up at Uncle Grady, he howled, "You yellow-bellied old buzzard! If you'd fought in the Mexican War, we'd have lost." Seeming to consider this, Uncle Grady gazed down. Then he hollered, "Them's fighting words, and I declare war." Before Grandma could stop him, he charged off his throne, balanced a moment on the edge of our float, and threw himself into space. He lit on Miss Wiedenbach's daddy, and they both rolled in the street, locked in combat, their medals and weaponry clanged like wild bells ringing out. "Don't use the sword, Uncle Grady," Grandma cried. By now, the Wabash Bluebird should have pulled out, but all the passengers were at the window staring at the spectacle. Two of the oldest men alive were brawling in the street, tangled up in each other, and Uncle Grady's sword, their small fists throwing punches. Now, they were so covered in dust and droppings you couldn't tell one uniform from the other. In the distance from the other side of town, the last of the high school bands blared, "The Stars and Stripes Forever." At length, Miss Wiedenbach separated the two old warriors, though her hoop skirt got in the way. Grandma would have let them fight it out. She came to the depot to see us off the day we left. It was to be our last visit together, and I suppose she knew, but she didn't say so. As the Bluebird appeared down the tracks, I had something to ask her. "Grandma, there's a loose end in my mind." "Well, don't trip over it," she said. "How do you know Uncle Grady Griswold is 103 years old?" "How do you know he's not?" She held her spidery old black umbrella between herself and the sun. "What I mean is, does he have a birth certificate or something like that?" "A birth certificate?" She waved me away. "They didn't have birth certificates in them days. You were just born, and people accepted it." But now the train was pulling in, hissing steam, so that was her last word. As Mary Alice and I scrambled aboard, Grandma heaved up a picnic hamper for us. We were hardly out of town before we were both slumped half asleep in the seat. A trip to Grandma really took it out of you. Dozing, I heard a mew. I looked down at our feet to see the lid rising on the picnic hamper. Two green eyes peered out. I shot a look at Mary Alice, who was only pretending to be asleep. "What's that?" She blinked in surprise at the green eyes blinking back. "For heaven's sake," she said. "It's the kitten. Poor little thing. It took her 3 days to find her way back from Uncle Grady's to the Cobb house. Grandma must have stuck her in the hamper, meaning me to have her. What a surprise! And yet you don't look too surprised. You could knock me over with a feather, Mary Alice sniffed, and lifted the kitten into her lap. How do you know Mother's going to let you keep that kitten? How do you know she's not? Said Mary Alice. And we steamed on, riding the Wabash Bluebird, bound for Chicago, across the patchwork fields.